The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, and by Thursday, Clara Fairchild had packed everything she owned into a single trunk and boarded a westbound train, because apparently her dead sister had left her not only 40 acres of Texas land, but also a husband who had no idea she was coming. Clara sat rigid in the hard wooden seat of the passenger car, the telegram pressed flat between her palms as though she might read something different into it if she smoothed it enough. Her lawyer back in Philadelphia had been very clear, maddeningly, infuriatingly clear, as lawyers tended to be. Margaret Fairchild, now Margaret Winslow, had died of fever 6 weeks ago, leaving behind a parcel of land outside the town of Harlan Creek, Texas, a modest homestead with a working well and a small herd of cattle, and one living husband by the name of Clarence Winslow, who had married Margaret only 8 months before her passing. Because Margaret had died without a proper will of her own, and because the land itself had originally belonged to the Fairchild family estate, the property reverted by law to Clara as the sole surviving Fairchild heir. The husband, the lawyer had explained with practiced delicacy, comes with the arrangement in the sense that he is currently living on and working that land, and you will need to discuss with him the nature of your intentions regarding the property. Clara had stared at the man across the desk and said, very quietly, "He is not a piece of furniture." The lawyer had agreed that no, Mr. Winslow was not a piece of furniture, and had then proceeded to hand her a stack of legal papers that essentially treated the situation as though he were one. She had not written ahead. She had not sent a telegram. She told herself it was because she wanted to see the land with fresh eyes before anyone could prepare a performance for her, but the truth was quieter and more uncomfortable than that. She did not know what to say to a man whose wife had just died, who had not asked for any of this, who would now find a stranger stepping onto his porch with legal ownership of everything around him. There was no telegram in the world that could soften that arrival gracefully. The train rolled through landscape that grew steadily drier, flatter, more severe. The lush green of Pennsylvania gave way to the red-brown earth of Texas, to sky so enormous it felt like an accusation, to distances that made Clara feel very small and very far from anything she had ever known. It was the spring of 1882, and the West was still very much a living, breathing, dangerous thing. She had read enough newspaper accounts to know that the romance of it was largely invented by people who had never actually been there, and enough letters from Margaret over the years to know that the reality was dust and hard work and loneliness so thick you could spread it on bread. Margaret. Clara closed her eyes and let herself feel the grief for a moment, which she had been carefully not doing since the telegram arrived, because grief had a way of making her useless, and she could not afford to be useless right now. Margaret had been 2 years older, the bright one, the adventurous one, the one who had answered an advertisement in a Philadelphia newspaper from a Texas rancher seeking a wife who was not afraid of wide open spaces. Clara had sat in their shared bedroom and read the advertisement over her sister's shoulder and said, "Margaret, you cannot be serious." And Margaret had laughed that enormous laugh of hers and said, "Somebody has to be." She had gone. She had married Clarence Winslow. She had written letters full of dust and heat and also, unmistakably, happiness. And then she had died in the April fever season, and now Clara was sitting on a westbound train with her single trunk and her stack of legal papers, inheriting a life she had never asked for. The town of Harlan Creek was smaller than she had imagined, which was saying something because she had imagined it very small. A single main street with a general store, a saloon, a post office, a livery stable, a doctor's office, and a scattering of other establishments that she catalogued quickly from the seat of the hired wagon that was taking her out to the Winslow property. The driver, a cheerful man named Pete who had skin like old saddle leather and eyes the color of a summer sky, told her everything she needed to know about the town in the space of about 8 minutes, which was roughly how long it took to drive through it. He told her about the good water, the bad flooding in the winter of '80, the bank that had opened just last year, the general merchant whose prices were highway robbery but whose coffee was exceptional, and somewhat cautiously, the fact that Clarence Winslow was known in Harlan Creek as a man who kept to himself, but who could be relied on absolutely if you needed him. He was real torn up about Mrs. Winslow, Pete offered without looking at her, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. She was a fine woman, the whole town felt it. Yes, Clara said, she was. Pete did not ask anything further, which she appreciated enormously. The land, when they reached it, took her breath away in a way she had not anticipated. She had been prepared for harsh, for bare, for difficult. What she had not been prepared for was the beauty of it, which was the hard, uncompromising beauty of a country that did not ask permission and did not apologize. The grass was short and gold in the fading afternoon light. The sky was streaked with colors she did not have proper names for, some private mixture of copper and rose and pale violet that hung above the horizon like something from a painting. A low farmhouse sat at the crest of a gentle rise, stone-built, solid, with a covered porch running its full length and a kitchen garden visible along one side, already showing the green shoots of spring planting. A barn stood a little distance away, red-painted, its doors open to the evening air. And in the yard between the house and the barn, a man was working. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed, the way height becomes noticeable from a distance before anything else resolves into detail. He was working at a fence post that had evidently given him trouble, driving it into the packed earth with a heavy mallet, and the efficiency of the motion, the complete absence of wasted energy, told her this was a man who had done physical work his entire life. He did not hear the wagon approaching until Pete hallooed him from the gate, and then he looked up. Even from a distance, Clara could see the moment his expression changed. He had been looking toward them with the easy alertness of a man expecting nothing particular, and then something shifted in his face, something careful and closed, like a window being shuttered against weather. He set down the mallet and walked toward them, and as the wagon pulled up to the gate she got her first proper look at him. Clarence Winslow was perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two more in either direction, with the kind of face that sun and wind had worked into something honest rather than handsome in the conventional sense. His jaw was strong, his eyes a particular shade of gray that changed with the light, his dark hair pushing out from beneath a well-worn hat. He had the posture of a man who stood straight not because anyone had told him to, but because he had decided that was how he stood. He looked at Pete. He looked at the trunk strapped to the back of the wagon. And then he looked at Clara, and she watched him understand who she was without being told. "Miss Fairchild," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected and very controlled. "Mr. Winslow," she said. She climbed down from the wagon before he could offer to help her, which she suspected he was going to, and she held out her hand. He looked at it for a fraction of a second too long before shaking it. His grip was firm and brief. "You should have written ahead," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I probably should have." There was a silence between them that was not quite comfortable and not quite hostile, which was, she supposed, about the best she could have hoped for under the circumstances. Pete unloaded her trunk with cheerful efficiency and accepted the coin she offered him and drove back down the road toward town with the air of a man who was very glad not to be involved in whatever was about to happen next. Clarence picked up her trunk as though it weighed nothing and carried it toward the house without asking whether she wanted it there. She followed him up the porch steps and through the front door into a space that was spare and clean and utterly without any of Margaret's touches, which hit her harder than she had expected. She had thought there would be remnants of her sister here, small signs of habitation, a quilt she recognized or a vase she remembered. But the house was simply what it was, a working man's home, functional and unadorned, as though it had been carefully stripped of softness. Or perhaps, she thought, Margaret had not had long enough to put her stamp on it. 8 months was not very long. Clarence set her trunk in the small back bedroom and stood in the doorway of it with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. "I expected your lawyer," he said. "Or another letter." "I thought it was better to come myself," Clara said. She stood in the middle of the small room and looked at him steadily, because she had decided on the train that whatever else happened, she was not going to be apologetic about being here. She had not asked for this situation any more than he had. "I know this is difficult. I know you did not ask for this. But the land belongs to the Fairchild estate, and I am the Fairchild estate, and we are going to have to figure out what to do about that." His jaw tightened. It was a small movement, but she caught it. "Figure out what to do," he repeated slowly, as though he were tasting the words and finding them wanting. "This is my home." "I know that," she said. "Do you?" The gray eyes were direct now, and there was something in them that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but had the texture of both. "Because your lawyer's letter made it sound like a transaction, like it could be arranged, sorted out, signed over." He stopped. He looked at his hat. He said more quietly, "My wife is 6 weeks dead, and a stranger is standing in my house with papers that say she owns it." Clara felt the impact of that settle into her chest and stay there. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it without qualification. "I am truly deeply sorry for all of it." He looked up at her. Whatever he had been braced for, she suspected it was not that, offered that plainly. He nodded once, and something in his posture shifted, not softening exactly, but recalibrating. "There is a stew on the stove," he said. "If you are hungry." It was not warmth. It was not welcome. But it was what he had to offer, and she recognized it for what it was, and she said, "Thank you," and followed him to the kitchen. They ate in silence that was careful rather than comfortable, but there was something honest about it. Clara ate the stew, which was good, better than she had expected, made with obvious care even if it was simple, and she looked around the kitchen and thought about Margaret standing at this stove, stirring this pot, looking out that window at that enormous sky. The grief moved through her quietly, and she let it. "She talked about you," Clarence said without preamble when they were nearly through. Clara looked up. "Did she?" "Constantly." There was something in his voice that might have been the ghost of fond amusement. "Said you were the sensible one, the practical one. Said you kept your head when everyone else lost theirs." "She was the brave one," Clara said. "She was always the brave one." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said finally, "she was." That word, that simple agreement, told her more about his grief than anything else could have. She saw it in the set of his mouth, the way his eyes went somewhere she could not follow for a moment and then came back. She did not push. She finished her stew and offered to wash the dishes, and he did not argue, which told her he was tired in a way that went deeper than his body. She lay awake that night in the small back bedroom, listening to the sounds of a Texas night, which were nothing like the sounds of Philadelphia nights, full of insects and wind and the occasional distant conversation of cattle, and she thought about what came next. She had the legal right to this land. She also had the very clear understanding that exercising that right in any heavy-handed way would be both morally wrong and practically disastrous. She could not run 40 acres of cattle land alone. She had never been on a ranch in her life. She knew nothing about cattle or wells or fencing or any of the 100 other things that kept this place functioning. And Clarence Winslow, whatever his feelings about the situation, had been running it for years. She needed him. The question was what he needed, and whether there was any arrangement between them that could make this livable for both. Morning came early, announced by a rooster she had not known existed, and by the time she had dressed and found the kitchen, Clarence was already gone. She found coffee on the stove, still hot, and a note on the table written in careful, deliberate handwriting. Water pump on the south side of the house. Coffee beans in the tin on the shelf. Back by midday. It was not warm. But it was considerate, and consideration, she was beginning to think, was Clarence Winslow's native language. She spent the morning exploring the property on foot, which she was aware might be considered presumptuous, but which she felt she needed to do. She needed to understand what she had inherited. The kitchen garden was further along than she had realized the night before, neat rows of beans and squash and tomato starts, planted with the confidence of someone who knew what they were doing. The well was solid, its rope and bucket in good repair. The barn held 6 horses, 3 of them work horses and 3 of them better bred, an attack room so organized it looked almost military. There were chickens in a coop behind the house and a second, smaller structure she eventually identified as a smokehouse. And there was cattle. She found them in the lower pasture, perhaps 40 head, mixed in coloring, moving slowly through the spring grass with the unhurried purpose of animals that have never been asked to hurry. A hired hand she had not yet met was moving along the fence line checking posts, and he looked up when she approached, startled. His name was Hector. He was perhaps 45, Mexican-born, with a round, kind face and careful eyes. He had worked for Clarence for 3 years. He told her this in a voice that was polite and watchful, the voice of a man gauging the temperature of a new situation. "The cattle are healthy," Clara said, because it seemed like a good thing to establish. "Yes, ma'am," Hector said. "Mr. Winslow keeps them well." "Good," she said. And then, because honesty seemed like the best policy here as it had been last night, "I know nothing about cattle, Hector. I am going to have to learn. I would appreciate any patience you can spare." He looked at her for a long moment, and then something shifted in his face, a small warmth, the opening of a door. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and this time it meant something different. Clarence came back at noon as his note had promised, and he found her in the kitchen garden on her knees pulling weeds from between the tomato starts. He stopped at the garden fence and looked at her for a moment without speaking. "The weeds around the beans are worse," she said, without looking up. "I will get to those after." "You do not have to do that," he said. "I know I do not have to," she said. She sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was dusty from whatever morning work he had done, and there was a grease stain on his forearm that suggested machinery of some kind. He looked, in the midday sun, less clothes than he had last night. Fatigue had a way of eroding defenses. "But I am going to be living here, and living here means contributing to what keeps it running. I may not know anything about cattle, but I know how to weed a garden." He looked at the garden. He looked at her. "You said you are going to be living here," he said, very carefully. "Yes." She met his eyes. "I know that is not what you expected. I know it is not what you hoped for. But I cannot sell this land to a stranger, Mr. Winslow, and I am not going to put you off it. So if you are willing to work with me rather than against me, I think we can figure this out." The silence stretched between them, long and complicated and full of things neither of them was saying. "What does figure this out look like?" he said finally, in practical terms. "I would like to learn how the ranch runs," she said. "From you. I would like to take nothing for granted and assume nothing. I would like to earn my place here if you will let me try." She paused. "And I would like, if it is possible, to understand what Margaret's life was like. What made her happy here? I missed 8 months of her life and I will never get them back, and this place is all I have left of that time." That last part was not strategic. It simply came out of her unplanned, and she saw it land on him differently than anything else she had said. His throat moved. He looked away, out over the pasture for a moment, and when he looked back his face had changed in some fundamental way that she could not quite name. "All right," he said. "Come on. I will show you where to start." The days that followed were unlike anything Clara Fairchild had ever experienced. She was not soft. She had never been soft, having grown up in a household that valued practicality and hard work, but she was city soft in ways she had not been aware of until now. Her hands blistered and then hardened. Her back ached from work she had not known she was using those particular muscles for. She learned to wake before dawn because the work required it, learned to read the sky the way Clarence did with a quick measuring glance that told him something about the day ahead. She made mistakes, plenty of them, and Clarence corrected them without cruelty and without condescension, which she had not been entirely sure to expect. He was a patient teacher. That surprised her. He had seemed closed and controlled in those first hours, and she had expected him to remain that way, to instruct her in a voice stripped of personality. Instead, she found that when he was explaining something he cared about, something real and practical, the control loosened slightly, and the actual man behind it became visible. He had opinions about the best way to string a fence line and the worst way to treat a sick calf and the precise moment in the morning when the light was right for checking the herd's condition. And those opinions were given with a quiet conviction that she found, to her own surprise, charming. He did not talk about Margaret unless she asked, and she was careful about when she asked. But sometimes in the evenings, when they sat on the porch after supper in the fading light with the sky performing its nightly miracle of color, he would say something unprompted. He told her about the first meal Margaret had cooked in this kitchen, which had been remarkably good despite her having no experience with a wood-burning stove. He told her about the morning Margaret had decided to learn to ride, and had managed 3 minutes in the saddle before the horse decided it had other ideas, and how she had laughed about it all the way back to the house. He told her these things in the careful voice of a man handling something breakable, and Clara listened without interrupting because she knew these stories were not just for her. She noticed that he smiled when he told them. Not a large smile, not the kind that took over a face, but the particular small smile of someone remembering real happiness. It changed him entirely, that smile. Made him look younger and more open, like a window thrown wide on a fine morning. She noticed it the way she noticed most things about him, carefully and without intending to. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, they had their first real argument. It was about the north pasture fence, which Clara felt needed immediate repair because 3 of the fence posts were already leaning at angles that would not survive another season, and Clarence felt could wait another month because they were not yet in immediate danger of failing. The argument was conducted in the practical terms of 2 people who were both, it turned out, stubborn. "If you wait until the posts fail," Clara said, "you will lose cattle. And then you will be fixing the fence and rounding up cattle at the same time. I know this land," he said. "I know how long those posts will hold." "You have been looking at them for 2 years," she said, "and that is exactly why you cannot see them clearly anymore. I have been looking at them for 3 weeks with fresh eyes, and I am telling you they are worse than you think." He stared at her. She stared back. The wind moved between them with complete indifference to the dispute. "Fine," he said after a long pause. "We will fix the north fence." They fixed the north fence. It took 2 days and was deeply unpleasant, hot work. And on the second day, a post that had appeared merely leaning suddenly pulled completely out of the ground as they were working beside it, proving her point definitively. Clarence looked at the collapsed post and then at her, and she had the enormous self-control not to say anything, and he had the grace to say, "You were right." "Thank you," she said, equally serious. And then they both laughed, which was the first time either of them had laughed in the other's presence, and it surprised them both into silence almost immediately afterward, and then Clarence picked up the post and they went back to work. Something had shifted with that laugh. Something small and molecular, the way temperature changes the texture of a thing without being visible. They did not speak about it. They both pretended, in the comfortable silent way of people sharing space, that nothing had changed. But she noticed that he walked beside her now instead of slightly ahead, and that when he handed her tools he did it without the fraction of hesitation that had been there in the beginning, and that the evenings on the porch had grown longer, the silences between their words grown easier to sit in. She had been there 6 weeks when she met Emmett Brand. Emmett Brand rode onto the property on a Thursday morning with 2 men behind him, and the air of someone who expected to be received. He was perhaps 50, thick through the shoulders, with a wide hat and a wide smile that did not go to his eyes. He owned the neighboring spread, She Would Learn, and he had been after the Winslow land for 2 years, wanting to expand his own operation. He had, apparently, made Clarence several offers that Clarence had refused, and had then tried a different approach after Margaret's death by sending a letter directly to Clara's Philadelphia lawyer, suggesting that Miss Fairchild, being an inexperienced single woman with no knowledge of ranching, might find it easiest and most profitable to simply sell. Clara had known about this letter. She had not mentioned it to Clarence. Emmett Brand tipped his hat to her with elaborate courtesy and explained very smoothly that he was simply coming to pay his respects and to offer any assistance a young woman alone might need in the management of such a difficult property. "I am not alone," Clara said pleasantly from the porch steps, "and the property is not difficult, thank you." "Well now," Brand said, his smile widening in a way that made her want to take a step backward, "that is the spirit, certainly. But there are realities to ranching that I am learning quite capably," she said. "Thank you for the call, Mr. Brand. Good day." Brand looked past her, and she realized without turning that Clarence had come up behind her, which she had not heard because he moved very quietly for a large man. She could feel his presence at her shoulder like something solid. "Winslow," Brand said, his tone shifting slightly. "Brand," Clarence said. There was an entire conversation in those two words, Clara thought, conducted entirely in the language of men who understood each other's position precisely and had nothing further to say about it. Brand touched his hat again, looked at Clara one more time with those flat eyes, and turned his horse. When the three riders were through the gate and back on the main road, Clarence said quietly from just behind her shoulder, "He wrote to your lawyer." "Yes," she said. "You knew." "Yes." A pause, "And you did not sell." "No," she heard him let out a slow breath. "I should have told you about his offers," he said. "I should have warned you about him." "You did not know if you could trust me yet," she said simply. "That was reasonable." He came around to stand beside her on the steps, which put them at approximately the same height, and he looked out at the road where the dust from Brand's horses was still settling. His expression was complicated, something turning over behind those gray eyes. "Can I trust you?" he said, and it was a serious question asked seriously. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "This is my sister's home. I intend to honor that." He nodded slowly, and this time the nod meant something fuller than the first one he had given her the night she arrived. That evening, he told her the full story of Brand's campaign to acquire the Winslow land, which stretched back to a water dispute 2 years ago, when Brand had tried to claim rights to the creek that ran along the northern boundary of their property. Clarence had spent a month in Harlan Creek working with a lawyer on the documentation and had won the dispute, but Brand had not forgiven it. He had been applying pressure in the slow, grinding way of a man with more resources than his neighbor. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal exactly, just the constant weight of someone richer making things slightly more difficult at every turn. Clara listened to all of it with the focused attention she gave to problems that needed solving. "We need better documentation of the property boundaries," she said, when he finished. "And the water rights should be reviewed again. The original Fairchild deed may have language that strengthens your position." He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as the one he wore when she surprised him. "You know about property law." "My father was a property lawyer," she said. "I grew up reading deeds the way other children read stories. Margaret used to say it was the least useful skill I possessed." She paused. She was wrong about that. His mouth curved. That small, real smile. She was wrong about some things, he agreed gently. She wrote to her father's former partner in Philadelphia the next morning, requesting the original Fairchild land deed and all associated documentation. Then she spent 2 days organizing the papers Clarence kept in a battered wooden box under the kitchen table, which turned out to contain everything needed, but in an order that defied rational understanding. By the time she had sorted and cataloged it all, she had a clear picture of the property's legal standing, which was stronger than Clarence had realized. "You are very organized," he said, watching her spread papers across the kitchen table on the second day. "I am very anxious," she corrected him. "Organization is how I manage it." He sat down across from her, which put him close enough that she was aware of him in a way that was becoming slightly uncomfortable to be aware of. "What are you anxious about?" he asked, and his tone was the careful, direct one he used when he actually wanted to know something. She looked up from the papers. The honest answer was, "A great many things, some of which I cannot discuss with you." She gave him a partial truth instead. "That I will make a mistake that cannot be fixed, that I will do something wrong with this place or with the legal situation and it will cost us." He was quiet for a moment. "You have not made a mistake, yet that cost us anything," he said. "The north fence is standing." She laughed softly. "That is a low bar, Mr. Winslow." "Clarence," he said. She looked at him. It was the first time he had offered his given name, and she knew it for what it was. "Clara," she said in return. He nodded once and they went back to the papers, but the kitchen felt different after that, warmer somehow, the silence between them companionable rather than careful. The summer settled over the ranch like a heavy quilt. The days were long and hot and full of the thousand tasks that a working cattle operation demanded, and Clara threw herself into all of them with the thoroughness that was her nature. She learned to ride, starting on the steadiest of the work horses and graduating, by July, to one of the better-bred animals that Clarence kept for his own use. She learned to read the herd for signs of illness and to check the water troughs and to manage the kitchen garden through the brutal Texas summer heat. She learned to cook on the wood-burning stove that had defeated Margaret for 3 days, though it only took Clara 2, which she considered a reasonable improvement. Hector taught her more than she had expected. He was a patient instructor, and she gradually understood, a perceptive one. He saw things. He watched the way Clarence looked at her when she was not looking, which was in a way Clarence did not seem entirely aware of himself. He said nothing about it, being a discreet man by nature, but sometimes Clara caught the small, quiet smile on his face when he thought neither of them was watching, and she thought she understood what he was smiling at. She was not quite ready to think about what she understood. She thought about Margaret instead, which was easier and harder at once. She found evidence of her sister gradually, in small things, not the large dramatic remnants she had first looked for, but the quiet ones. A handprint in the mortar of the kitchen hearth, too small to be Clarence's. A book tucked in the window seat with Margaret's initials penciled on the inside cover. A pressed wildflower in the pages of that book, already brittle with dryness, that had been picked in some bright spring moment and saved for reasons that were entirely private and now permanently lost. Clara kept all of it. She kept the book on her own bedside table and the pressed flower carefully between 2 pieces of paper in her trunk, and she felt that in doing this she was doing something important, though she could not have explained exactly what. One evening in late July, she came downstairs to find Clarence sitting on the porch with a half-finished letter in his hands, reading it. He looked up when she came out, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then she saw what he was holding and she recognized the handwriting. "Is that from her?" she asked quietly. He folded it carefully and set it on the porch railing beside him. "From before," he said. "From when she was still in Philadelphia, before she came out." He paused. "I read them sometimes, when things are difficult." Clara sat down in the other chair, the one that had become hers over the past months. The sky was beginning its evening performance, the horizon going copper and rose. "She wrote wonderful letters," Clara said. "She wrote to me from here too. I have them." He looked at her. "Will you tell me something from them?" he asked, and his voice was quiet and careful. "Something good," she thought. She said the sky was the thing she had not expected, Clara said. She said she had tried to describe it in her letters, but that no words she knew were big enough. She said the sky made her feel like she had been living in a house with very low ceilings her whole life and someone had finally taken the roof off. His face, in the evening light, did something she had not seen it do before. It went open and unguarded and entirely human, and she saw the grief in it clearly and also the love, and they were the same thing, which she had known intellectually but which struck her viscerally now, watching it on his face. She felt her own throat tighten. "Yes," he said very softly. "That was exactly right." They sat in silence after that, but it was the kind of silence that holds a great deal inside it without needing to explain itself. And when the stars came out, which happened here with a sudden completeness that she still was not used to, neither of them moved to go inside for a long time. The letter from her father's partner arrived in early August, and it contained precisely what she had hoped. The original Fairchild deed, included a comprehensive description of the water rights along the Northern Creek boundary that was far more explicit than the county records that Brand's lawyer had been working from. It also included language establishing that any portion of the property sold or transferred must carry these rights with it, intact and undivided, which meant that Brand's long-term strategy of chipping away at the water situation piece by piece had a fundamental legal obstacle he had apparently not known about. She spread the documents out on the kitchen table with the careful satisfaction of someone who has just laid down a winning hand, and explained it to Clarence in detail. She watched his expression move through the information, slow and thorough, the same way he did everything. "This means he cannot touch the creek access," he said. "Not through any legal means," she said. "And it means that if he ever tries again, we have the original documentation to bury him with." The word "we" came out of her naturally, and she did not notice it until she saw him notice it. His eyes moved to her face and stayed there for a moment before he looked back down at the papers. But something had changed in the room, some small shift in the air between them that she was aware of in her fingertips. "I will take these to Harlan Creek tomorrow," she said, arranging the papers into order. "Have them filed with the county clerk. I will come with you," he said. They rode into town together the next morning, which was the first time they had done so, and Clara noticed the way Harlan Creek noticed them. Small towns had a comprehensive awareness of their inhabitants that made Clara think of organisms, every part aware of what the others were doing. People who had nodded at her individually since her arrival now looked at them together with a particular quality of attention. The woman who ran the general store, a forthright woman named Mrs. Dobbs who had been cautiously friendly since their first meeting, smiled at them as they passed with the specific smile of a woman who thinks she knows what is happening and is pleased about it. Clara filed the papers with the county clerk, who was a meticulous and efficient man clearly delighted by proper documentation, and then they stopped at the general store for supplies and had coffee at the small table Mrs. Dobbs kept for her preferred customers, and Clara noticed that Clarence in town was slightly different from Clarence on the ranch. He was greeted by people who clearly respected him, and he received that respect with the same quality of quiet steadiness he brought to everything else, not dismissing it and not inflating himself with it either. He introduced her not as the woman who owned the property, which was legally accurate but would have been pointed, and not as his late wife's sister, which was accurate but awkward, but simply as Clara Fairchild, which was accurate and dignified and told her something about how he thought about her position that she found she was glad to know. "You have friends here," she said, as they rode back. "Neighbors," he said. "In a country like this there is not much difference." "In Philadelphia," she said, "there is a great deal of difference." He glanced at her sideways. "Do you miss it?" She considered this honestly. "I miss things about it," she said. "I miss certain streets. A particular bookshop. My father's garden." She paused. "I do not miss the feeling of it, the smallness of it, everything very close together and very predictable." "Margaret said the same thing," he said, and this time saying her name did not create the same quality of painful pause it had in the beginning. It came out easier, more natural, still tender but not raw. She said she did not know she was suffocating until she stopped. "Yes," Clara said, and looked at the enormous sky around them and thought that perhaps suffocating was exactly the word. They were nearly back to the ranch when a loose stone sent Clara's horse sideways in a startled lurch. She managed it, catching her seat and steadying the animal with the new confidence of someone who had spent months learning, but Clarence had moved toward her before she had it under control. His own horse pulled up beside hers, his hand out though not touching, the instinctive reach of someone prepared to catch her. She looked at him. His hand was still there, half extended between them, and he looked at it and then at her, and the color that moved over his face was something she had not seen before. He pulled his hand back and looked ahead at the road. "I was fine," she said gently. "Yes," he said, "I know." They rode the rest of the way in a silence that was charged in a way she recognized and did not know what to do with. August became September, and September brought the first real turning of the season, the brutal heat easing into something merely demanding, the evenings cooled by breezes from the north that made the porch livable past dark. The cattle were fat and healthy, and Clarence had been talking to the cattle agents from San Antonio about the fall sale, which Clara sat in on and contributed to with a directness that surprised the agents and clearly pleased Clarence, who let her take the lead on the pricing discussion with a trust that she felt in her chest like something warm. They got a good price, better than the previous years, according to the ledger book. They celebrated without planning to, with a bottle of wine that Mrs. Dobbs had obtained through some mysterious general store alchemy, and they sat on the porch while the stars came out, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with cattle or fences or water rights. He told her about growing up in Tennessee, the youngest of 4 brothers on a farm that was never quite enough for all of them, about coming west at 22, because the West was where a man with nothing but his own work ethic could actually build something. She told him about her father's law practice and the books she had grown up reading, and the way she had spent her 20s helping her father with his cases, because she was not allowed to practice law herself, which was an injustice she named plainly and without bitterness, because she had made her peace with it by finding other ways to be useful. "You could practice law in a different country," he said seriously, which made her look at him with something she did not immediately know the name of. "In a different century, perhaps," she said. And then, because the wine had made her honest in ways she was usually careful about, "My sister was the one who was supposed to have the adventures. I was supposed to be sensible and stay home and help father. And instead," he said, "and instead I am here," she said, "in Texas, which is considerably less sensible." "Is that what you think this is?" he said. "Sensible or not," she looked at him. The stars were out in their impossible Texas abundance, the Milky Way spread across the sky like something spilled. His face, turned toward her, was serious and asking something that was not entirely about sensibility. "I think," she said carefully, "that this is the truest thing that has happened to me in a long time." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said at last, "that is how I think about it too." They did not say anything else about it that night, and she did not expect them to. Clarence Winslow was not a man who said things before he had thought them through to the bottom, and she respected that. But the saying of it, even obliquely, even in the comfortable ambiguity of people who had not yet named what they were doing, felt like something important had been moved from one side of a scale to the other. October brought trouble of the kind she had not anticipated. 2 of the cattle came in sick, and Clarence identified it as tick fever, which was manageable if caught early and potentially catastrophic if not. He sent for the doctor from Harlan Creek, a lean, practical man named Dr. Pelham, who was as comfortable treating livestock as people, and between the 3 of them they quarantined the affected animals and treated the rest of the herd with a methodical thoroughness that left all of them exhausted at the end of 3 days. None of the other cattle developed symptoms. They had caught it in time. On the 4th morning, when the crisis was clearly past, Clara came downstairs to find Clarence already at the table with his coffee, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the particular release of tension that follows a bad period safely survived. She poured her own coffee and sat across from him, and they looked at each other in the morning light with the particular intimacy of 2 people who have just been through something difficult together and know it. "Thank you," he said. "We did it together," she said. "Yes," he said, "but I am thanking you." She held his gaze and felt the warmth of it, the clear, uncomplicated warmth of being seen by someone who knows what you have done. "You are welcome," she said. He looked down at his coffee and then back up at her, and she thought he was going to say something else, something different, something from a different register entirely. But Hector knocked at the kitchen door at that moment to report on the condition of the quarantined cattle, and the moment passed, and she told herself it was all right, that there was time, that things were moving in the direction they were moving regardless of what was said and when. She believed this, but she was also 27 years old and did not have the kind of patience she was pretending to have. The crisis with Emmett Brand came in November, when Brand sent 2 of his men to move the fence line on the northern boundary by approximately 30 feet, which would have placed the creek access on Brand's property rather than Clarence's. Hector found them doing it on a Wednesday morning and came for Clarence immediately, and Clarence went out there with the particular stillness of a man who has reached the outer edge of his patience. And Clara went with him because she was the one carrying the copy of the original deed in her coat pocket, which she had started doing 2 months ago precisely because she had not trusted Brand to stop. Brand's men were large and unhelpful. They had a counter-document, which proved on inspection to be a poorly drawn approximation of the county survey, and which Clara dismantled with crisp precision while standing in the November wind in the middle of a pasture, citing the original deed language in the kind of tone she had learned from her father, which was the tone of someone who knows they are right and is under no obligation to be apologetic about it. Brand's men looked at each other. They looked at Clarence. Clarence was simply standing there being tall and steady and entirely unmoved, and the fact that he was not saying anything was, in its own way, more effective than anything he could have said. They left without argument, taking their posts with them. That, Clarence said as they watched them go, was extremely effective. The deed is extremely clear, Clara said. I just read it out loud. You read it out loud, he said, in a voice that I would not argue with under any circumstances. She looked at him and found that he was looking at her with the full, open attention that she was still not quite used to. That made her feel visible in a way that was not uncomfortable, exactly, but was very much something. We should write to Brand directly, she said, keeping her voice practical. With a formal notice of the deed language and the filing date and a very polite indication that any further attempts to alter the property boundary will result in legal action. Yes, he said, and he was still looking at her with that expression. We should. I can draft it tonight, she said. Yes, he said again, but this time what he said next was not about the letter. He turned toward her slightly and said in a quieter voice, Clara. She waited. I need to say something to you, he said, and I have been putting it off because I did not think it was right to say too soon. I was not sure it was right to say at all. He stopped and looked at the horizon for a moment, at the wide, flat November sky. Margaret has been gone 8 months. You have been here 5. And I have been trying very hard to be honest with myself about what is happening in that time because it seemed wrong not to be honest, given everything. She was very still. The wind moved between them with its cold November voice. I was not expecting you, he said. When your lawyer's first letter came, I was angry. I thought, here is a stranger who is going to come and take my home, or make it impossible, or turn everything Margaret and I built into some kind of legal dispute. I had prepared myself to fight. He paused. And then you arrived, and you sat at my kitchen table and told me you were sorry, just plainly, without any of the business around it, and you started weeding the kitchen garden the next morning, and I did not know what to do with that. You showed me how to fix a fence, she said softly. I showed you how to fix a fence, he agreed. And somewhere between the fence and the cattle auction and 3 months of evenings on the porch, I stopped thinking about it in terms of what I was prepared to fight, and I started thinking about it differently, about you differently. He met her eyes, and his were very direct, very clear. And I think you know what I mean. Yes, she said. I know what you mean. I want to say it plainly, he said, because I think you deserve plain. I have developed feelings for you that are not appropriate to the circumstances as I originally understood them, and I need you to know that, and I need you to know that I am not going to push anything or rush anything, because this is your home too, and your comfort here matters to me entirely regardless of anything else. Clara listened to all of this with the focused attention she gave to everything important, and when he stopped she said, Are you finished? He blinked. Yes. Good, she said. Because I have developed the same feelings, and I have been trying to be patient about it, which is not a skill that comes naturally to me, and I would like very much for you to stop calling them not appropriate to the circumstances." He stared at her. Then slowly, that smile, not the small careful one she had seen before, but something larger and fuller, something that went all the way to his eyes and changed his whole face into something that was not just honest but openly, completely glad. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. There was still the November wind between them and the wide sky overhead and the Texas land around them with all its demands and difficulties, and none of that was going anywhere. But he reached out and took her hand, which was bare because she had pulled her gloves off to hold the deed, and his was warm despite the cold air, and she held it back with the simple certainty of someone who has decided. They walked back to the house that way, and Hector, who was near the barn when they came through the gate, looked at their joined hands and then straight ahead at the fence post he was working on, but she could see from 20 feet away that he was smiling. She drafted the letter to Emmett Brand that evening in the kitchen while Clarence read and the stove burned down to coals, and when she read it to him, he listened with his chin on his hand and his eyes on her face and told her it was excellent, which she already knew, but which was also nice to hear. They talked about the property and the plans for the spring planting and the cattle sale proceeds that she wanted to put toward improving the barn roof, which was showing its age. They talked about ordinary things in the warm kitchen, which was what they did every evening, except that now his hand found hers across the table between topics, easy and unhesitating, and it changed the ordinary things into something that felt very much like a life. He kissed her on the porch in December, on a cold, clear night when the stars were at their most extreme and extravagant, and she had been expecting it for 3 days in the way you expect something you want very much when you can feel it coming, and it was still better than she had expected. He kissed her with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, deliberate and thorough and entirely present, and she kissed him back with all the practicality she possessed, which turned out to be quite a lot. "Well," she said when they broke apart, looking up at him in the cold starlight. "Well," he agreed quietly. She laughed, and he did too, and then he put his arm around her and they stood on the porch in the December cold and looked at the stars for a while longer, which was an entirely satisfactory thing to do. The letter to Brand produced no response except a significant and telling silence, which was in its own way an answer. Brand had clearly consulted his own lawyer about the deed language and received advice he did not like. In January, he made one more approach, this time direct and personal, showing up at the gate alone on a quiet Tuesday morning and asking to speak with Clara. And Clara came out to the porch steps with Clarence beside her and heard Brand out with perfect courtesy as he suggested, with considerably less smoothness than before, that perhaps a settlement arrangement might be reached. "What kind of settlement did you have in mind?" Clara asked, with the pleasant attentiveness of someone who has read about this particular approach. Brand talked for several minutes about fair prices and practical considerations, and the challenges of managing a property as a single woman. Clara listened to all of it and then said, still pleasantly, "We are not interested in a settlement, Mr. Brand. The property is not for sale. The water rights are documented and filed. Any further attempts to alter the boundary will result in legal proceedings that I am prepared to see through to completion. Thank you for coming out." She looked at Clarence, who had said nothing during this entire exchange, and who now looked at Brand with a gaze that required no elaboration. "Good day." Brand rode away, and he did not come back. It was February before Clara sat down and wrote the letter she had been composing in her head for months. It was to her friend Dorothy, back in Philadelphia, and it was the kind of letter that covered 7 pages and touched on everything from the condition of the winter grass to the specific quality of Clarence's character that she found most remarkable. Dorothy wrote back in March, a letter that was effusive and delighted and full of questions that Clara had to sit and think carefully about answering. She was sitting at the kitchen table with Dorothy's letter when Clarence came in from the morning work, cold-cheeked and clear-eyed, and found her there with the letter and the particular expression she wore when she was thinking hard about something personal. "Good news?" he asked, pouring coffee. "My friend Dorothy is asking if I plan to stay," she said. He sat down with his coffee and looked at her with the directness that was simply how he was. "And do you?" he said. She looked at him. Outside the kitchen window, the Texas winter was white and spare and clean, and the land was waiting, as it always was, patient and enormous. She had been here 9 months. Her trunk had been unpacked for 7 of them, her things distributed around the house in the natural way of a person who has stopped thinking of themselves as a visitor. Her handwriting was in the ranch ledger. Her knowledge of the property had surpassed her sister's in practical detail, not because she was better than Margaret, but because she had been here longer. "I am staying," she said. "I should have told Dorothy this 3 months ago. I have been," she paused, smiling a little at herself, "being cautious." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I have been thinking," he said, "about how to ask you something." She waited. He looked up from the coffee cup. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said, with the directness he brought to everything important, "but I want to be sure that you understand it is not about the property. The property is yours regardless. It will always be yours regardless. I want to be clear about that first." She felt something in her chest settle into a position that felt exactly right. "I know that," she said. "Because I want you to say yes because you want to," he said, "not because it seems like the sensible arrangement." "Clarence," she said, "do you know what I do when I do not actually want something?" He considered. "You say so," he said, "directly." "Immediately and directly," she confirmed. "So if I were saying yes because it seemed sensible, I would not be saying yes. I would be telling you what would actually make sense, and then I would be doing that instead." His mouth curved into the full smile, the one that changed everything. "That is true," he said. "Ask me again," she said. He put down the coffee cup and reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Clara Fairchild," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He leaned across the table and kissed her, and Dorothy's letter fell off the table onto the floor, and neither of them picked it up for a while. They married in Harlan Creek in April, which was exactly 1 year after Margaret had died, and Clara had received the telegram that changed her life. Clara chose this date consciously and deliberately, as a way of closing one circle and beginning another, and when she explained this to Clarence, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "She would have approved of this extremely thoroughly." And Clara laughed, because it was true, because Margaret would have been insufferably pleased with herself, because Margaret had always been the brave one and the adventurous one and the one who went first, and in going first she had, without knowing it, made a path. The wedding was small and genuine. Mrs. Dobbs from the general store came, and Pete, who had driven her from the station, and Hector, who wore his best shirt and looked dignified and quietly moved. The reverend who performed the ceremony was a practical man who kept his words short and let the occasion speak for itself. Clara wore a dress she had made from cloth she had ordered from Philadelphia, blue, the color of the late afternoon sky, which was a choice that required no explanation to anyone who had ever watched a Texas sky in the evening. Clarence wore a suit that fit him like it had been made for him, which it had, because Clara had quietly arranged this 2 months ago with the tailor in Harlan Creek, who had been pleased by the commission and impressively discreet about it. They stood in front of the reverend and said their vows with the directness of 2 people who take words seriously. And when Clarence put the ring on her finger, she felt the weight of it as something real and chosen, something she had arrived at through her own work and her own days in this hard, beautiful country. When they kissed and turned to face the small gathering, Hector was definitely crying, which he denied when she caught his eye, but which she would tell him about later for years. The spring after the wedding was the best season the ranch had seen in several years. The rains came at the right intervals, and the grass grew thick, and the cattle were magnificent, and the fall sale that year beat the previous year's price by a margin that made both of them sit with the ledger and look at each other with the quiet satisfaction of people whose work has paid off. They used some of the proceeds to improve the barn roof as Clara had planned. They used some more to hire a second hand, a young man from Harlan Creek named Sam who was 17 and going on 80 in terms of work ethic, and who within 6 months had become as indispensable as Hector. They bought 2 additional horses and repaired the smokehouse and put a new pump on the south well, and each improvement was both practical necessity and the visible accumulation of a life being built. Clara wrote to Dorothy and told her everything. Dorothy wrote back and said she was going to come visit, which she finally did in the summer, making the train journey from Philadelphia with the air of someone who has decided to be adventurous, and the hidden terror of someone who has never been further west than New Jersey. She lasted 2 weeks on the ranch, during which she declared the sky impossible, the coffee excellent, the smell of cattle deeply challenging, and Clarence Winslow exactly right, Clara, absolutely exactly right, which she said while watching him fix a wagon axle in the yard with the focused capability of someone who knew what they were doing. He is, Clara agreed from the porch. Dorothy left with a sunburn and a greatly expanded sense of the world, and the specific, satisfied expression of someone whose friend has landed exactly where they should be. In the autumn of their first full year of marriage, Clara told Clarence she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, at the kitchen table, with the same plainness with which she told him everything, and watched his face go through something she had never seen before, something undefended and enormous, a joy that was almost too big for his face to contain. He put down his coffee cup and came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took her hands and looked at her with those gray eyes that she had learned to read in all their shades, and what she saw in them was exactly what she felt. "A baby," he said, as though the word were something he was learning the shape of. "In the spring," she said. He leaned his forehead against their joined hands and she felt the warmth of him and said nothing for a moment, letting the spring morning hold them both. "Are you frightened?" he asked, looking up. "Somewhat," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Terrified," he said, and the fact that he said it so plainly without any pretense was one of the things she loved most about him. "Good," she said. "Then we are starting from the same place." He laughed and stood and kissed her with the particular tenderness of a man who has just been told something that has rearranged his world. And she held him and looked past his shoulder at the kitchen window and the Texas sky beyond it, and thought about all the ways a life could change without warning, and how the best changes were the ones you could not have predicted. She was careful through the pregnancy, working at a modified pace that frustrated her because she did not naturally operate at modified paces, and that Clarence supervised with a protective attention she pretended to find excessive and actually found completely endearing. He built a cradle in the evenings through the winter months, in the barn where it was warmer, and she would sometimes stand in the doorway and watch him work on it, his large, careful hands moving over the wood with the same precision he brought to everything, and feel something so vast and quiet inside her that she did not have a proper word for it. The child came in April, which turned out to be their season, and was a boy, which surprised Clara slightly and delighted Clarence completely. They named him James, after Clarence's father, and also, in a small private way that Clara held in her chest, after the month that Margaret had married Clarence in, because it seemed right to have something of Margaret's story woven into this new one. James arrived with a full head of dark hair, and the immediately evident conviction that the world owed him its entire attention, which he expressed volubly and without apology. Dr. Pelham declared both mother and child perfectly healthy. Hector arrived at the kitchen door with his hat in his hands and his round face entirely overcome with emotion, and Clara told him to come in and sit down, and she put the baby in his arms, and Hector looked down at James Winslow with an expression of pure reverence that made Clarence have to look at the ceiling for a moment. The ranch settled into the rhythms of a family home over the years that followed. Clara resumed the full work of the property once James was past his early months, often with him strapped against her in the particular practical arrangement she had devised, which scandalized Mrs. Dobbs mildly, but which was effective. She continued managing the legal and financial side of the operation, which had grown more complex as the ranch expanded, because Clarence's reputation and the quality of their cattle had brought attention from buyers as far away as Kansas City. They bought an additional 15 acres to the east 2 years after James was born, which brought the total property to 55 acres and gave them room for a larger herd. The water rights from the Fairchild deed applied to the new parcel as well, which Emmett Brand, who had not directly bothered them since January of the previous year, learned about from his own lawyer and accepted with the visible displeasure of a man who has permanently lost a game. He did not approach them again. In the way of things, his own operation ran into trouble the following year due to poor management and an outbreak among his cattle that he handled badly, and he sold off his land in pieces and moved to Houston. When Clara heard about this, she did not feel triumph exactly, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who outlasted something that needed outlasting. James grew into a child who combined his father's steady thoroughness with his mother's directness, which created a personality that was absolutely certain of its opinions and absolutely capable of the work required to support them, and which kept both his parents simultaneously delighted and challenged. He could ride before he was 5. He could read before he was 4, because Clara taught him with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, and because he attacked the skill with the same appetite he brought to everything else. 2 years after James came a daughter, whom they named Margaret, because there was no other name. Margaret II came into the world with considerably more ease than her brother had and considerably less noise, looking around the room with large considering eyes as though conducting an assessment. She grew into a child who was quieter than James and twice as observant, who followed Hector around the property learning every detail of the operation with a focused attention that Hector bore with the profound happiness of a man who has found an apt pupil. She had Clara's coloring and Clarence's patience, and some quality entirely her own that neither of them could account for, a stillness that saw everything. James, at 4, received his new sister with scientific interest and the immediate conviction that he was responsible for her welfare, which he expressed by positioning himself between her and any perceived threat for approximately the next 15 years, which would have been more effective if she had required protection, which she largely did not. Clarence, watching his children, had an expression that Clara had come to call his thankful look, which was not ostentatious and not performed, just a quiet settled quality he carried when things were very right. She saw it often. She felt its equivalent in herself so constantly that it had become simply the temperature of her days. She thought sometimes about the telegram on that Tuesday morning, the one she had pressed flat between her palms on the train, and the feeling of traveling towards something she had not chosen and could not have predicted. She thought about stepping off a hired wagon onto a Texas ranch in the spring evening with her single trunk and her stack of legal papers, and a man turning from his work to look at her with those gray eyes closed and wary as shuttered windows. She thought about the first night, the careful silence over stew, and the first morning, the note on the kitchen table. She thought about the north fence and the kitchen garden and the evenings on the porch growing longer as the weeks went on. She thought about the moment she had heard him say her name for the first time and know, in the particular deep way of knowing that bypasses argument, that she was going to be all right. It had not been what she planned. It had not been what either of them planned. She had come to Texas to handle a legal situation, and somehow, in the handling of it, found the actual shape of her life. It seemed to her that this was what Margaret had been telling her all along, in those letters full of enormous sky and hard work and unmistakable happiness, that somewhere you have not thought to look there is a life that fits you better than the one you designed, and the only way to find it is to step off the wagon. She had stepped off the wagon. The rest had followed. On an evening in the spring of 1887, 5 years after Clara had arrived at the ranch with her single trunk, she was sitting on the porch in the warm dusk while the children played in the yard below. James was chasing something, a beetle or a leaf, with great dedication. Margaret was sitting in the dust building something architectural with sticks, her small face composed in concentration. Clarence came out from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and sat in his chair beside hers and handed her one, and they sat in the companionable silence they had been developing for 5 years, which had grown so comfortable and so fully inhabited that it was its own kind of language. The sky was doing what Texas skies did in the spring evenings, the full, extraordinary performance of color that she had never once taken for granted since the first time she had seen it. Copper and rose and pale violet, the same as the first evening, as every evening, as though the sky had decided this was its gift to the people who were patient enough to watch it. James caught his beetle and announced the capture to the yard at large with considerable triumph. Margaret looked up from her architectural project, assessed the beetle, said something judicious and inaudible, and returned to her building. "James has been asking about school," Clara said. "I know," Clarence said. "He told me, at length." "He wants to go to the schoolhouse in town," she said. "Mrs. Patterson apparently has a reputation." "Mrs. Patterson does have a reputation," Clarence agreed. "She taught half the people in Harlan Creek." "Then I think we should let him go," Clara said. "Next fall," he said. "Next fall," she agreed. James would go to school in Harlan Creek and Margaret would follow him 2 years later, and they would both, in their different ways, be rather remarkable at it. James would come home full of history and mathematics and argument, and Margaret would come home full of science and literature, and quiet observations that her teacher would tell Clara were the best in the class. And Clara would sit at the kitchen table in the evenings and help them with their lessons and feel the particular satisfaction of education given freely, which was what it should always be. But that was later. On this evening in the spring dusk there were just the 4 of them, and the sky, and the land that went on in all directions with the unhurried confidence of something that would be there long after they were. And Clara held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the children in the yard and felt her husband beside her, warm and present and entirely real. "What are you thinking about?" Clarence asked. She looked at him. In the fading light his face was older than the day she had arrived. Of course it was, but she was aware that what she saw when she looked at him was not primarily what the years had done. She saw the man who had handed her a cup of coffee on a difficult morning and written a note to tell her where the pump was. The man who had laughed with her over a stubborn fence post and sat in the starlight telling her about his wife. The man who had said, plainly and without decoration, that she deserved to hear things said plainly and then said them. "I was thinking about the telegram," she said, "the one that told me to come here." He was quiet for a moment, and he said, "And I was thinking that Margaret sent me a letter from here once," she said, "telling me about the sky, telling me she had been living in a house with very low ceilings her whole life and someone had finally taken the roof off." She looked up at the enormous spread of the sky above them, still burning at its edges with the last of the sun, stars just beginning to appear in the deep blue overhead. "I think I understand now what she meant. I think I understand it completely." Clarence set down his coffee cup and reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, the same way he always had, easy and certain, the gesture of a man who knows where he is going and has stopped being surprised by how glad he is to be going there. "Yes," he said simply. Below them in the yard, James had released his beetle and was now teaching Margaret, who had not asked to be taught, a running game that required a great deal of noise. Margaret was tolerating the teaching with the patience of a younger sibling, who has calculated that patience is more effective than protest. The evening air moved warmly around them. The stars were coming out, one by one and then all at once, the way they always did in Texas, as though they had been there all day waiting for the light to step aside. The north fence was standing. The water rights were filed. The ledger showed 5 years of steady building work. The cradle that Clarence had made in the winter before James was born was in the barn now, waiting, cleaned and sanded and quietly patient. They had talked about this, about the family they were building. In the particular unhurried way they talked about the future, which was as something that would come in its own time and would be met when it arrived. This land was Clara Fairchild's inheritance, and also she understood now her gift. Margaret had come here and been happy, briefly and genuinely and completely. She had left behind this place and this man and this enormous sky, not as a burden, not as a problem to be solved, but as something she had known Clara would understand once she saw it. She had always been the brave one, Margaret had, the one who went first and made a path. She had gone first into this country and into this life, and then she had, in the particular generous way of those who love us, left the door open. Clara had walked through it. She had weeded the garden and fixed the fence and read the deed out loud in a November pasture, and said yes at a kitchen table on a February morning, and married a man under an April sky, and put her handwriting in the ledger and built, slowly and carefully, and with all the practicality she possessed, a life that was hers in a way nothing before it had been. She held Clarence's hand in the spring dusk and watched their children play in the yard below, and let the enormity of the sky be as large as it wanted to be, because she had learned in 5 years in this country that the right response to something overwhelming and beautiful was not to make it smaller but to simply grow larger yourself, to expand into it, to become the kind of person who can hold it without flinching. Margaret had known she could do that. She had said so in those letters full of enormous sky, the sensible one, the practical one, the one who kept her head. She had just needed, like everyone, to find the right sky to keep her head under. James was calling to her from the yard below, something about a game that apparently required her participation. She called back that she would be down in a moment, and he accepted this with the negotiable patience of a 5-year-old. And she looked one more time at the horizon where the last of the color was fading into the purple of evening. "Shall we?" Clarence said, and they went down together into the warm and ordinary and completely extraordinary business of the evening, the children, the supper, the lamplit kitchen, the voices of their family filling the house that had been built for exactly this, as though it had known all along what was coming, and had simply been waiting for them both to arrive.